The Conquer Worry Show, episode number 6.
This show is not to be considered medical advice. The contents of the show are for informational purposes only. Nothing should be considered or used as a substitute for professional medical or mental health advice, diagnosis, or treatment. If you are struggling, please seek professional medical assistance and call 911 if there is an emergency. Global hotlines can be found on conquerworry.org.
Welcome to the Conquer Worry Show, the show dedicated to creating awareness of the resources that are available to those who struggle with worry, anxiety, or depression. If you are struggling now, if you've struggled in the past, or someone you love is struggling, this is the show for you. Thanks for joining us for another edition of the Conquer Worry Show. I am your host, Jay Coulter. I am not a psychiatrist, a psychologist, a counselor, or a social worker. Just someone who has struggled with depression and anxiety, come through to the other side, and now I'm dedicated to creating awareness of all the resources that are out there for people who are struggling. In today's episode, I'm going to play an interview I conducted with Travis Martin of militaryexperience.org. As you'll hear in the interview, he has put together an organization that helps soldiers who are struggling with worry, anxiety, depression, PTSD, find a creative outlet. So really, I can't do his organization the same justice that he can in the interview. So why don't we get right to our interview with Travis Martin. Today on the Conquer Worry Show, we are speaking with Travis Martin. Travis is the president of Military Experience in the Arts. This is a nonprofit, volunteer-run organization whose primary mission is to work with veterans and their families to publish creative works, poetry, artwork, and scholarship in 4 different journals that we're going to discuss today. The organization got started back in 2011 when he helped publish the Journal of Military Experience, which today is known as Military Experience and the Arts. If you would like to review his website as you're listening today, head on over to militaryexperience.org. Again, that is militaryexperience, one word, .org. Travis, thanks for coming on the show today.
Thank you for having me, Jay. I really appreciate this opportunity.
Sure. So, hey, first, why don't you give us a little bit of your background?
Okay, so I, like a lot of people, I'm a college dropout, and I made it about 2 weeks after graduating high school before realizing I didn't have the maturity needed to really do well. So what I did instead was I joined the Army. I did a 4-year contract and ended up serving 2 tours in Iraq in 2003 and 2005. And when I got out, I went back to that same college that I had dropped out of and graduated with my associates, and then moved on up a little farther north to Eastern Kentucky University and got my bachelor's and my master's degree in literature. And currently I'm working on a PhD at the University of Kentucky. So I just kind of made my way north a little bit at a time.
Yeah. Well, tell us a little bit about the PhD program, and have you chosen a dissertation topic yet?
Sure. I'm currently entering the dissertation stage, actually, this semester, and I'm interested in different writing therapeutic arts groups that have emerged in the wake of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. Because what I found when I'm looking around is that military experience in the arts isn't alone. There are lots of grassroots organizations out there that are holding workshops, leading online communities, and sharing the words and artwork of veterans just all over the country. And I want to kind of tell their story. I want to say this is a response to a need. The veterans need this outlet as a way to kind of express themselves and explain what they've been through. And more importantly, perhaps, is the educational benefit that it has on society as a whole. that what they're doing in these groups, when shared with others, it helps others understand what they've been through. But it also completes kind of a healing cycle, in that the veterans tell these stories, which some of them may be horrific and terrible, but when they're accepted by society, then the veteran feels as if they are accepted by society. So I think it's a very important movement that's kind of going on organically. And I started one small organization, but I want to kind of talk about all those others who've done the same.
Okay. Well, great. Well, let's talk about that. So can you give us a little bit of a history of military experience in the arts before we talk about some of those organizations that are under the umbrella?
Sure. So this all started whenever it was my first semester teaching college. I had been tasked with starting a orientation to college course just for student veterans. And so I had about 26, I think, my first semester. And at about the same time, I had gotten really into war literature and this notion that writing and reading about war could actually be a way to heal. Because I had been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder after my second deployment. And when I got back the first 2 years, I found it really hard to talk about war. I didn't watch the news. I didn't want to mention it. I had a lot of avoidance symptoms, and that's what I learned later that they were called. Well, then, about my last semester of my undergraduate work, I took a memoir course from a professor, and one of the memoirs she assigned was Colby Bazel's work, My War. And so I found myself, for the sake of the class, really having to get out of my comfort zone. I really had to kind of dive into this war literature text and expose myself to not only scenes of war, but scenes from my own war in Iraq. And what the teacher did, this professor, Deborah Core, is she said, I want you, when you write about this book, to write about it from the perspective of a veteran, not as a detached observer, not as someone who's just there as a critic or a scholar, but you've been through this. Talk about it in a way that you use your experience. And that was really the first time in all of my college years, leading up to that I'd really been able to put those experiences to work in a practical way. And before long, I found myself, doing the opposite of avoidance. I was diving into war literature. I was diving into these theories of trauma and trying to understand this notion of how do you write about things that are so fragmented and so hard to think about. Because I started reading more literature, and I would ask myself, how is Tim O'Brien able to write about these things that happened in the Vietnam War so clearly and succinctly? Because I couldn't even muster a short story. And so I got really into that. And and at the same time I was studying, I started that class, and I told my students, I said, look, you can have the option of taking the multiple choice exam, or you can write me a short story. You can write about anything you want to write about. You can write about your basic training experience, funny things that happened, or war. And sure enough, about 80 or 90% of the students decided to write about war and trauma. I felt like they placed a lot of trust in me, that they put themselves out there. And because I was a veteran, because I was their teacher, and I think now because they didn't have anyone else to talk to about these things, they decided to write about some of the hardest things that they had been through. Well, the semester ended, and I had all these stories collected, and part of the requirement for that assignment was that they had to go through the editing process with me. So we went through back and forth 5 or 6 times on some of these stories, getting them to where they needed to be publishable. And I told them, I was like, okay, you've done these stories, but you don't have to publish them, but you can. And pretty much everyone decided that they would. And so we started what's called now the Journal of Military Experience. And the Journal of Military Experience featured a lot of work from my students and a few from students outside the class who were veterans. But it really it gave those vets who took the class a chance to really express themselves for the first time, because the writing process and having someone mentor you as an editor allowed them to put their best foot forward. It allowed them to kind of tell their story the way they wanted it to be told, without having to kind of pull together all those traumatic fragments here and there, whatever was in the brain at the time. They were able to make a concise, complete story and then give it to people and tell them about what they had been through, some of them for the first time. And that's how the organization started, was with that journal. And later, as I continued my career and moved on to another university, I saw that there were more and more people interested in doing this. We received a grant from the organization Phi Kappa Phi, the Honor Society, and they helped us publish the second volume. And in that volume, we reached out to veterans all over the nation, and that was 3 times larger than the first one. Well, once that one got out, I got some news coverage from some national outlets, and we started getting submissions from all over. So many submissions, in fact, that I couldn't fit them all in a single book. At the same time, we were getting lots of people saying they wanted to volunteer to help us. So I spun the Journal of Military Experience off into 4 other journals and put them under the umbrella of Military Experience in the Arts, or MEA.
Okay. So tell me about Blue Nostalgia. Does that fit into that sequence?
Absolutely. Blue Nostalgia is the literary journal of our Veterans PTSD Project. And the Veterans PTSD Project itself is dedicated to educating society about post-traumatic stress disorder, but with the emphasis on post-traumatic growth, this notion that you can overcome a traumatic experience, live through it, and also live through it in a way that makes you stronger in the long run. Now, part of our mission here is that we don't see a lot of positive examples of veterans with post-traumatic stress disorder coming back and leading productive lives. We see these negative models found in movies, found in the news media when they focus on the person committing a crime who just so happened to be a veteran, and they list veteran first. We see lots of that. And veterans see lots of that. Young veterans coming back from war, looking for models, looking for, people to mold themselves after. And so we decided to start a journal that was, focused on this notion of post-traumatic growth. And we did this in a Facebook group last fall, and the summer before that, we got together a group of, I think it was around 20 authors, and we said we're going to write about our traumatic experiences, but we're not going to just focus on the war aspect. We're not just going to, try to give people what we call this war porn, because they're really interested in the violence and all the stuff that's really entertaining for movies. But we want to focus not so much on that, but how you overcame that and how your life changed afterwards and how this experience in the long run has made you a stronger, more resilient person. So all the stories in that journal are written in a workshop that really asks the authors to focus on that aspect of the traumatic experience, the growth.
So based on your experience, are there other organizations out there focusing on the positive model, to use your terminology?
I think a lot of times that, the stories that are being written with, just in workshops not focused on trauma at all, focus on that positive model. And the problem is that they're not being read and they're not being focused on by the larger media. And so one of the things we have to do when we run these kinds of organizations is to really push those stories and get them out there, because they're being told and veterans want to tell them, but it's a matter of getting society as a whole to listen. And what I found in my research in literature and the historical undercurrents surrounding that literature in the last 100 years is that society as a whole tends to ignore or try to at least push aside reminders of traumatic experiences. In the same way that I came home from Iraq and I didn't watch the news or I didn't want to talk about war because it was an avoidance symptom, I believe that society as a whole expresses some avoidance symptoms, that when confronted with this issue of war and children being traumatized within it and coming back and having to integrate in society, the society will kind of find ways to outmaneuver those stories. And so when we look at the larger movements, these grassroots movements I'm talking about, with organizations like the Veterans Writing Project or the Veteran Artist Program or any of the organizations listed on the Friends tab on our website, you'll find that a lot of these veterans are already telling these stories, but the next step is to get society to listen. And that's one of the primary goals of Military Experience in the Arts, is to really promote the works of our veterans so that those stories are told and understood.
That's fantastic. Well, tell us a little bit about the Blue Falcon.
Blue Falcon Reviews, our fiction journal, and we started that, as I said, because we had this influx of submissions, and we had a lot of authors who wanted to write through fiction, because a lot of times these stories are delicate in a nature that they can't write about what happened because of security clearances or because of things that happen that would make other people liable. So fiction as a genre really kind of gives veterans a chance to go in and write about things they otherwise wouldn't be able to. And it's also important because of the nature of traumatic memory. I mean, one thing I found early in my research was when I asked that question of how these war veteran writers are able to write such clear and succinct stories, was you have to fill in the gaps. In my own experience, a lot of my traumatic memories were fragmented. There were gaps. You'll hear veterans, and what makes, I'm going to do a little aside here, what makes veteran writing so fantastic is the way traumatic memories are recorded. They're very vivid, very focused on certain details. sometimes those details are innocuous, or the veteran doesn't really understand why the sound of the metal striking the metal is so important, because the brain, during the nature of the traumatic experience, focused in on that. And so what fiction does is it allows our authors to focus in on the aspects that they remember and to fill in the gaps without claiming that it's an entirely true story and trying to place it as something more of a journalistic mode.
Okay. And you also have a poetry project under the umbrella as well, correct?
Absolutely. We started with poetry in the first Journal of Military Experience, and then as our submissions grew there, we started a poetry journal. And helping me out, because I write poetry, but to be honest, I don't know how to edit it. And I asked for help. I asked for one of my former professors, Wanda Fries, from the Somerset Community College, who's a very well-known Appalachian poet and novelist. She came in and she mentored a lot of these veterans who submitted poems to us, because some of them were great to begin with, but some of them just need a little bit of tweak here and there, because poetry is a very fine art, and it takes a lot of experience and skill to really make those words connect and get across those experiences. So when she came in, she brought that skill set with her, as well as our new editors, Suzanne Rancourt and Jason Pouillet, who are both experienced veteran poets and who are really going to help us get this second volume out this fall.
Okay, great. Well, I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the success stories that you've had. Now, for our listeners, before the interview, Travis said that he didn't want to pick any favorites or pick any out for us to talk about to show any type of favoritism. So, Travis, I went onto the website where, again, if you go to militaryexperience.org, they show or spotlight different success stories from the organization. So why don't we start with Micah Owen? Could you tell us a little bit about that success story?
Absolutely. This one's really, really personal to me, because Micah and I served our entire 4 years together. And when we both got out of the Army, he went to his home in Crescent City, California, and I went to my home in Kentucky. And a few years down the road, I talked Micah into coming over here and to go in school with me. And he was an undergraduate about the same time that I was starting my teaching career. And in that first semester of teaching student veterans, he was in my class. So sure enough, I'm sitting there in front of the class with one of my best Army friends right in front of me. Now, Micah had been through a lot, and like a lot of veterans, he struggled too with the writing process. But over time, with me helping him, going through stories that we had both lived through together too, mind you. So it was very, very interesting to kind of look at this from a looking back now, because I had lived through these experiences with Micah, and I was helping him craft a story. So it kind of helped us kind of come to terms with our shared experience. Now, when Micah finished his story, I always tell people that he hadn't really talked to his family about what he had been through, that a lot of these things were, they were beyond what he was able to do in verbal words. But when we published that first volume of the Journal of Military Experience, he sent copies to his parents, to his aunts and uncles and his cousins, and it kind of helped him explain, what he had been through in his own terms and in a way that put his best foot forward. And so the first time he was ever able to explain that to his family was through the written medium. Now later, Micah actually completed a second work with us in the second volume of the Journal of Military Experience. And his father, who was also a veteran, contributed to the same volume, as did his cousin. So there's like a family reunion almost of sorts in our second Journal of Military Experience. And to top it all off, Micah, in his first writing experience, was featured in the New York Times Warrior Voices. And so I like to say, this was his first semester in college, like all of our authors, and he got to leave that semester already a published author. And in case of Micah, he got to leave a nationally known author featured by one of the larger magazines in the country.
Well, you talk about setting the bar high.
Absolutely.
Gosh, that also must have been a very rewarding healing process for him.
I believe it was.
Yeah. How about, let's talk a little bit about Ryan Koch.
Ryan Koch's a veteran I met at the Military Experience in the Arts Symposium. And after the second Journal of Military Experience got quite a bit of news coverage, I was able to convince the Kentucky Department of Veterans Affairs to fund a 3-day symposium at Eastern Kentucky University. Using those funds, we brought together lots of instructors in writing, lots of artists, lots of therapeutic organizations who came and presented workshops and led different interventions for our veterans. And we were able to bring nearly 130 veterans and military family members and clinicians and artists all together for this 3-day event. and Ryan Koch was one of those. Now, Ryan is becoming very well known very quickly in the social media realm for some of his opinions about veterans issues specifically. And one of the first times that he was able to actually go out and, really express himself in an official medium was through our poetry journal. And some of his poetry was featured in the first volume of Blue Streak. And now, since then, he's been really working harder to get to Washington, D.C., where he can someday get into politics and really advocate more heavily for veterans and for veterans' views in the Capitol.
Okay. Well, how about, and I'm going to apologize in advance, but Giuseppe Pellicano, did I get that right?
Yeah, you did.
Okay.
Giuseppe is one of the more impressive artists that I've seen, that I've come across in doing this. His work is very provocative, and it's something a lot of people talk about when he put it out there. His Grenade series specifically, which features these different scenes with the grenade, which is to symbolize this ticking time bomb notion of the veteran, I believe, and different scenes. One's with a kid having a tea party. He calls that work tea time. And you can see that on our website at militaryexperience.org, both under the spotlight we did on Giuseppe as well as in the third volume of the Journal of Military Experience, which is linked from the top. But Giuseppe is I believe he's a Bosnian war veteran, and he served some time in Germany as well as in the States. And his work is really focused on bringing awareness to this issue of post-traumatic stress. And I think it does a really good job because the way it provokes the conversations when we share it on our social media really seems to get people talking about it. And that's what needs to happen. We need to have these conversations about this issue, and artwork like Giuseppe's really does that.
Okay. Well, let's go from artwork to Art Shade.
Art Shade. Art Shade is one of the veterans that I've known the longest since I've been doing this. He's a Vietnam War veteran, and he's written two stories for us. One in the second Journal of Military Experience, and another in the third volume of the Journal of Military Experience. And his focus seems to be on this issue of living with post-traumatic stress and talking about this issue of post-traumatic growth. Even before we launched the Post-Traumatic Growth Journal, Art was writing about these things. His most recent work, Not Alone, actually featured in the third Journal of Military Experience, is about introducing himself to group therapy for the first time. And so Art, working with our editors, has been able to kind of go back and craft these stories in a way that will appeal to a larger audience. And we like to give him the platform on which he can discuss his experiences, because it's really important for veterans to be able to communicate about these things across generational boundaries. And Art's definitely one example of doing that in our organization.
Okay, another success story that I thought would be worth touching on is Rod Merkley.
Rod Merkley is currently in our fiction workshop we're leading right now. He was also featured in the first volume of the Blue Falcon Review. And not too long after that, his work was picked up by Time Magazine and featured on their website. And in fact, they compared him to Hemingway, Ernest Hemingway. And that's high praise for anyone in the authors' circles to be compared that way. So Rod Merkley is currently in the Army, and I believe he's working on a degree in mental health. So he tends to write about things directly related to veterans' mental health issues through fiction, to kind of tell those issues that he's coming across in his studies and in his career. And it's just another example of how these writing opportunities are helping veterans express those issues in different ways.
That is quite a comparison. I tell you, even for a novice like myself, I know those are big shoes to fill.
Absolutely.
So I noticed on the website, one of your success stories has won some money from his work, and I wanted to see if you could touch on that. Brian Mockenhaupt?
Yes, Brian Mockenhaupt. Brian Mockenhaupt is definitely one of the cornerstones of our organization. Whenever I first decided to take this nationwide with the Journal of Military Experience, I was introduced to him through email, and I didn't think for a second that he was going to take the time out of his busy schedule to help us, because Brian Mockenhaupt has written for places such as The Atlantic, Reader's Digest, all kinds of different really national magazines. And when I asked him, I said, this is what we're doing. We are helping veterans publish a literary journal, and we want to do away with the philosophy of just reject, not good enough. When the veterans come to us, we want to help them one-on-one as many times as we have to through different drafts to get to the standards needed to maintain, a really strong literary presence. And so when I told Brian these things, I said, well, this guy's been embedding in Afghanistan and Iraq. He doesn't have time for that. But sure enough, he made the time. And he helped us produce the second volume of Journal of Military Experience as well as the third. And he also wrote a short book. It's a nonfiction book. It's about the length of a novella. And it's featured by Byliner Press. And it's called The Living and the Dead. And it's about his experiences embedding with a group of Marines in Afghanistan. It eventually won an award, and I'm trying to remember the name of the award, but it won him $20,000 as a grant, and it really speaks to, this is a great person. Not only is he out writing great things, but he's also taking a lot of time out of his day-to-day schedule, and that's really the backbone of our organization, are these people who are successful, established authors willing to work with, our first-time authors and people who've never written before, because it means a lot to them. And I'm beginning to learn that it means a lot to our volunteers as well.
I definitely want to touch on those volunteers and how they help your organization. But before we do that, there's one more person I'd really like to hear about, because he has been able to give a TED Talk. And I always have a lot of respect for speakers who can get on TED and tell their story. So tell us a little bit about Eric Hodges.
I first met Eric Hodges at a symposium he threw. It was very reminiscent of the one I threw, but it was focused more on the academic side of things, and he called it the Veterans in Society Conference. Eric Hodges is a Marine veteran, and currently he's our scholarship editor for the Journal of Military Experience. So he's another example of a veteran really clinging to writing and the veterans community as a way of defining himself after the military. So I was really proud of Eric when he completed that TED Talk, and if you haven't listened to it, or if your fans haven't listened to it, then I really encourage you to really examine his words, because he really looks deeply at this issue of the veteran-civilian divide and the consequences of that divide, and proposes some great solutions. So Eric's definitely an up-and-comer in the academic realm, and his work is very noteworthy.
Well, we will include a link to that TED Talk in the show notes for this episode. But why don't we transition and talk about these volunteers that are helping your organization? Because I know from experience you can't do this yourself.
No, absolutely not. And I realized that right away. Even with the very first Journal of Military Experience, it was just so much work, because you're taking a story, and that story could require 5, 6, 7 drafts, and you've got to take it, you've got to read it, you've got to add that, the author has to fix it, and then someone has to put it all together into a manuscript, publish it. And then as we grew, these different chores, they took over, and it became a full-time job almost. And so, our volunteers really are spending a lot of time, because they're really, all of them believe in this benefits of writing as a healing intervention, as well as a way to educate society. And so, some of those are not veterans, and this is one way that I run military experience in the arts a little differently than some veteran organizations, and that I really encourage non-veteran participation, because I believe that veterans need to see that. They need to see that non-veterans are willing to take the time to really listen to their stories and help them, advance themselves after the service. So some examples of that are right there on our executive board. Right under me, the vice president is Mariana Grohowski, and she's a PhD student at the Bowling Green State University, and she's done a lot of work in this growing field of veteran studies, and recently she did some work with another MEA participant, Bridgette McCoy, and really focused on this issue of veteran social justice, and had her students who are not veterans researching these different grassroots organizations that I've been telling you about from a pedagogical kind of standpoint. And so Mariana is definitely one example, and her motivations, like a lot of people, is that her father was a Vietnam veteran, and she grew up around him and learned a lot about what veterans go through that way, and now she's trying to take that knowledge and kind of combine it with her research and her volunteer work as a way to kind of keep paying forward, this healing notion. Other examples are Lisa Day. Lisa Day is, probably one of the smartest editors that I've ever met, if not one of the smartest people. And I'm not saying that just because she's my girlfriend, but because she's also the secretary of the organization, and she's the last line of defense whenever I get all the works in and I compile it into the manuscript and I go through it myself. She goes over at the very last, because she is the sharpest tool in the shed when it comes to editing. And so without people like Lisa and her expertise, our work wouldn't be nearly as polished. And it goes on down the line. What I tried to do whenever the JME got so big was I spun it off into these different genre-specific journals, and I found the volunteers that were coming to me who had the skill set specific to those journals, and I created teams. And in those teams, I'm trying to recreate what I did with the first Journal of Military Experience, with all of these falling under the military experience and the arts umbrella.
Okay. Well, I tell you what, you have a lot of great volunteers, and you have a lot of qualified volunteers helping your organization. How can our listeners help, even if it's just from a promotional standpoint, military experience in the arts?
Two things immediately come to mind. It's first is the importance of people actually reading these works. And, we push this stuff nonstop. We have a growing social media outlet, but your organization will help us as well when this podcast goes out. But the one thing, people can do is actually just take the time to read the works, because the veterans are putting themselves out there, and the works are high quality. I can assure you of that, because it's been through so many drafts and so many different editorial reviews. And I just want to see people reading these stories, especially the ones about post-traumatic growth, because these stories are not being told. And veterans that are overcoming trauma and overcoming, grief and worry and these different mental obstacles, they are out there. And other veterans need to know about them, but also society as a whole. Because the average veteran who comes back from war with PTSD or with any other illness for that matter typically ends up to be a contributor to society, not a dead weight. Veterans are very valuable, and they're out there today, and they are telling these things. And that's one way that your listeners can help. Another way is we're always looking for qualified editors, qualified readers, because the first thing we do typically, if a work is not produced in a workshop, is we partner the author with someone who gives them one-on-one time. And we try to do that for every single author who comes our way. So if you know someone, or you yourself have writing skills, or just a great teacher, you don't have to have published 10 books to do this. I mean, someone who's a good teacher could do this. Someone who could just be, a fresh set of eyes, as they say.
Okay.
Be a great help.
Okay. Well, good. Well, I tell you, for the final question here, Travis, and this is a little bit off topic from your organization, but it was very clear when you and I had a pre-interview call that this is your life's purpose. And, I end every episode of the Conquer Worry Show encouraging our listeners to live in relentless pursuit of their life's purpose. So in thinking about that yourself and finding this as your life's purpose, could you talk a little bit about the experience of coming across this as your passion? And just so our listeners know, Travis isn't compensated for all the work he does here. This is truly a passion of his.
Absolutely, and that's true of all of our volunteers. None of us have been paid a single dime, and we continue to do this because we believe in it. And, you asked me about why I do this and how I got into this. And it all goes back really to why I joined the Army, because I picked a college major that I really wasn't good at. I picked business, and I was a good writer, and I liked to write. And when I got out of the Army, I decided, look, I got my school paid for. I'm going to do what I love. And so I picked English as my major. And then as I got further into academia, and I came in contact with more veterans, and I started to learn more about, how as a community, veterans weren't able to tell their stories. They didn't have the skills or the platforms needed. I kind of saw, a place opening up for me there. And I said, well, I've got this skill in writing. I've got this skill from being in the military, and I've got, this real desire to bring people together in these creative communities, and all that kind of came together. And so it seems to me that I seem to draw people together around communities, and I also seem to do it with a creative goal in mind. And so for some reason, God has put me in this place, and so that's where I intend to stay. And that's as long as I can possibly keep all this together and all these volunteers organized and writing coming out, I'll keep doing it.
Well, you've definitely landed in the right spot. Travis, I appreciate you joining us today. Listeners, head on over to militaryexperience.org. As Travis suggested, please read some of the work that the fine folks at that organization are putting out. Support them in any way you can. Travis, thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you.
I really want to thank Travis for taking the time to do that interview. He actually had been at a conference all week, got home, and we did it on a Saturday afternoon. And as a PhD student working on his dissertation, you know how precious their time is. And not only did he take time to do the interview, he takes clearly a tremendous amount of time to run that organization. I encourage you, whether you're in the military or not, take a look at militaryexperience.org and try to support their works. And like Travis said in the interview, if you can just read some of the work that those folks are putting out, that would go a long way. And to wrap up this episode of the Conquer Worry Show, I got to tell you, I've had some feedback from friends who aren't afraid to say what they think. They say, Jay, you're a little too serious and stiff on your podcast. You're a funny guy. You need to loosen up, even though what you talk about tends to be serious stuff. Listen, if you could connect with us on conquerworry.org, connect with us on Twitter, connect with us on Facebook, we would really appreciate it. But what would really help us right now are some reviews in the iTunes directory. So if you found us on iTunes, please go, write a comment, hopefully give us 4 or 5 stars, and that'll just help increase the exposure of this podcast. I want to thank everybody for joining us for this episode. And as always, remember to live in relentless pursuit of your life's purpose.